well, I guess we thought we'd really focus on culture, on organisational culture today in our conversation, because it's something that not an awful lot is written about, but it's very powerful to experience as a social worker in an organisation. Do you agree?
Absolutely, and I think it's fascinating. I love thinking about how organisations work and what drives them and what it might be like to actually be, you know, in particular different organisations. And I think that, you know, understanding the organisational culture is so important, and particularly for social workers where we might be in organisations where there's not a lot of other social workers often. Yes. So the culture can feel a little bit disconnected from perhaps what we might think of in terms of our own values and way of practicing sometimes. So I think it's really important to you know, to get a good understanding of what the culture of the organisation is like. But I also think that it's actually quite entertaining at times to be able to sit back and have a think about what's going on in this organisation and what's actually driving it. So yeah, so I think I could talk forever about culture in organisations. But I guess, you know, maybe it's helpful to think about, well, what are we talking about when we talk about the culture in an organisation? And I guess it's not dissimilar to the way we talk about culture in the broader society, because we're looking at, well, what are the norms in the organisations? What are the values? What, you know, how do people go about their work? What's driving that? What's the history of the organisation? Because of course that has an impact on culture as well.
How do people behave toward each other?
Exactly, yes.
In ways that are less formal or informal.
Yes,
Or even what's the acting out or the enactment of formal policies, because it can be very different in Office A compared to Office B.
Absolutely.
And that can be with the same set of policies and procedures, can't it?
Absolutely.
Often to do with organisational history and the culture.
And of course that all has an impact when you understand the culture, and you get a good understanding of how decisions are made and why they're made in a certain way. But you also get a sense of who do you go to, or how do you actually initiate change and decisions in that organisation. If as a worker you can see that there's a need to bring around some change, bring a change around as well. But it's interesting. I remember when I went for the job in one of the offices at Centrelink many years ago, I had been working in a very busy inner city office, and it was an older building, and everyone kind of was always busy running around. It was a very chaotic kind of feeling in there. And I think you kind of pick that up and you respond to that, because that's what you kind of are socialised into really when you come into that organisation. And I had an interview at a regional office, and I walked in there. It was a brand new building. It was very big, very open. It had this very relaxed sort of you know, feeling about it, and I felt relaxed, and I thought, I think I could work here. And I had to wait in the tea room while I was, you know, because there was already somebody being interviewed. And I can remember in the tea room and people coming in, they were all so calm. And it wasn't actually the reality of the work once I got the job, but it was interesting, the feeling that I had, even from the way that people actually went about, you know, their day in that time. And I did end up working in that office, but it was a good example of how too, that what you see and what you hear, once you scratch the surface a little bit, there's a lot that goes on with culture around how things actually really do happen in an organisation. And you need to be switched on about that and be thinking about what is actually driving you know, the decisions that are made, and who has the power in the organisation. Because it's not always the managers. No, not always the person with the most senior role. Absolutely. It can be those who have a great deal of influence for a whole range of reasons that ultimately do have the power. Absolutely. It's true. And I guess what's coming to mind for me is the iceberg metaphor that I know we've got in the slide. So what we're really talking about is not the formal policies or processes on top of the iceberg and above the waterline, but what you don't easily see or readily see, and what's not necessarily written down, and that is what's beneath the waterline. The way that we behave toward each other, the way that we communicate, how decisions are made, that's outside the formal policy dictates that, you know, what are the processes that are going on, who influences who and who has the power, just a few examples. And it can even come down to what sort of banter happens in a particular team and a particular workplace, and what might be seen as acceptable by a team may not be acceptable to a new team member that comes into that, and that can be a real challenge for people who are new to teams about, okay, I can see that this is part of the way the team operates, but this is not okay with me. How do I influence this? What can I do about it?
Yes. Do I overt that, or is the new person, am I a little bit vulnerable? At what point can I reflect on what I'm seeing, or perhaps question or challenge?
And then and challenge, what can I do about that?
Certainly true for our students going out on their first and second placements.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking, and really trying to have a sense of analysis as to what's the culture, and how comfortable they are with that culture is really an important part of the placement, I think.
And it's that sort of thing that gives you a sense about so that how we interact with each other, I guess, in an organisation gives you that sense of, is this a place I can really see myself working for a long time, or as a student on placement, once I leave the placement, is this the sort of organisation I would want to come back and work with? And it might not be the work with clients that is the decider. It's more likely to be, how am I accepted within the organisation, within the team? How am I treated within the organisation?
As a person and as a professional. I guess one of the things I'm thinking about as we speak, Natasha, is my experience of transition from bureaucracy to one bureaucracy to another. So I came from the Child Protection Service, very large bureaucracy, and to the university just a few years ago. And the culture that I had really grown up in many ways professionally, I hadn't just been there, but I'd been in and out, and mostly inside an organisation where, for a particular reason, because you're working with statutory clients in particular circumstances, I think it's understandable that the culture is that people speak very directly. If you don't agree with a decision that's being made in a meeting, more often than not the culture is to absolutely name it and to have robust debates and discussion. That being said, it's also strongly hierarchical. So often think about numbers next to your names, because people have numbers next to their job titles, and that says where they sit in the hierarchy. And often, another observation of culture is that in a meeting, the person with the highest number would be the first one to speak, and others will then make decisions about when they'll speak or what they'll say based on the person with the highest number speaking. And so I did come from an organisation where I felt quite comfortable about being quite assertive about my view, about having a view, and about disagreement, and that was certainly, in my experience, encouraged and facilitated in the organisation. I came to a new bureaucracy, and that was the university. And not to say that dissent was discouraged, but I couldn't find it. I found the models of communication were so very different, and I do laugh when I think back now, just 3-4 years ago, that I would sit in staff meetings or in more informal meetings, and I found it really difficult to know when a decision was being made. And I found it very difficult to know when people were disagreeing or agreeing, because there was just lots of kind of reflection. And it was interesting. And where did I sit in that? I was very vulnerable. I felt incredibly vulnerable because I didn't know. I didn't know how to navigate that.
It's interesting because I probably had a different organisation but similar pathway, came from working in a government agency bureaucracy where I was the person that people came to about knowledge and how would you approach this, and you've been here for a while, Natasha, so, you know, can we just pick your brains about this? And not just in my office, but, you know, across different offices, probably similar to yourself, actually, in DHS. And so when I came here to the uni, I was kind of not that, you know, I knew nothing, and it was like, I don't, you know, and it was a big shift for me in terms of the way that I managed myself, but in terms of meetings and discussions, I actually didn't feel like I was at the point where I could offer anything, and I think that that's actually partly about the culture and perhaps coming into a culture, and how do you kind of become familiar with that.
Yes.
But also partly about myself in terms of my identity within one particular culture, and then having to re-establish an identity and get the understanding of that in a new culture as well. And I think that can take a lot of time, but is very much dependent on the culture that you can come into. Like, I've gone into another organisation where, again, I wasn't, you know, my skill level, I was still building that up, but a very different experience. Would have had no hesitation actually asking questions or disagreeing. So it is interesting to think about how the culture that grows over time actually then really does have that impact on new workers coming into it. And I think that for those of us who've been in organisations for a long time, again, or, you know, because I've been here for a little while now, we should be mindful of that, really, shouldn't we? In terms of how do we invite people into the culture in an organisation. And I think social workers are in a good place in any organisation.
We should
to be thinking about that.
Yes, we agree.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.